This week I'm excited to tell you about the best stand that I ever hunted and hopefully how you can find something similar to this where you hunt. And I'm going to start back in 2009. That was the first time we hunted this spot, and it kind of evolved over the years. I stumbled onto it more by accident really than by design. There was a buck living in this part of the farm that I was really excited about trying to kill, a deer that I had a little bit of history with, a big old massive deer. So it was the end of December when Drew Yarkowski and I got into a cedar tree right on the edge of this little 1 acre planted soybean field. And the deer were super spooky, and some coyotes came out. And Bubba did come out into the field, but some coyotes came out on the nearby field and spooked him, and they all ran off, and we never got a shot at him. That was the introduction to that location. And the next year, it was beans again, and I put a ground blind right on the base of that cedar tree where Yarkowski and I had been sitting. So when the shotgun season came, our son Drew was in there with me, and this really good buck came out, a deer that we had nicknamed Flyers, and he made a good shot and killed that deer. So now we've got really 2 awesome encounters from this one spot, and we're starting to get some momentum. We're starting to think that, okay, here's a spot that we need to figure out. The next year, I think it would have been 2011, I got my first redneck blind. And I think that was shortly after Redneck actually came out with blinds. They might have been in business for a year or maybe slightly more before that, but that was the first one I had, and the spot that it went was right here. So now I've got a blind in this spot, and the deer can't see us as well. If we keep the windows closed, the ones on the downwind side really can't smell us that well. So it's more like now finally we can spend some time here and we can find out how good this spot really is. And over the next 10 years, roughly 10 years I think that I own that, man, we killed more big deer, our family did, out of that spot than anywhere else on the farm by far. And I remember when I sold the property, I said, I'm going to sell you everything but 1 acre. And the guy looked at me kind of funny, and I pulled the map out and I showed him this spot, and I said, I'm going to keep this 1 acre. And he just chuckled, and of course I was just kidding him, but boy, it was and still is the best spot that I've ever hunted. So now I want to talk about why it's so good and how you can recreate similar circumstances someplace else. It was tucked up right up against the bedding area. So the one end of it, the west end of it, was in really kind of the southwest and the northwest. That whole end of that small field was surrounded by bedding. On the back side, away from that, were the open ag fields. So the deer could come out of the bedding area, stage up in this little small field, feed, socialize, and then move on through and go into the open ag fields where they would feed in the evenings. So it was what I started calling a staging area food plot, because the deer would stage there like a transition spot before they headed out into the big ag in the evenings. And if these spots are tucked far enough into the timber, they also become really good morning spots too, because now the deer will come from the open areas. They'll hit these little small staging areas before they disperse and go out to bed. Not only does it concentrate the deer into a small enough location that you can, realistically bow hunt them, but it also is the first place that the deer are on their feet in the evening, in daylight. So it served a lot of really good purposes. Lots of daylight activity, focused, concentrated movement, so it was easy to bow hunt, and then the deer moved through. So it was a transition area, so when it was time to climb down, there wasn't, that much that you had to, there weren't that many deer around. It wasn't hard to get out of there at the end of legal shooting time, or to get in there first thing in the morning, before the start of legal shooting time. So these became kind of the go-to spots on my farm. I found 5 or 6 more spots like this that I created over the years that I owned that place, and they were dynamite. There's nothing really you can do to a hunting area to make it better than to create one of these little staging area food plots. And even if you're hunting on permission, a lot of times these are naturally occurring, these little small openings, and you'll see them just inside the timber. Maybe it was an old homestead. For some reason there was a little pocket in there that's now grown up to brush, or even more common, you get out on point fields, and as the field starts to narrow as it goes out on the point, the farmer has started cutting that corner now. He used to go back in there with his smaller equipment and he would make that whole loop, but now he has to cut it off because his planter is too big and the sprayer is too big and everything's too big to go way back into that corner of the field. So they get grown up to brush naturally, And these are spots that even on permission, farmers generally aren't going to tell you no if you ask them if you could, clear that and plant it either to clover or some kind of a brassica. Some of my best ones were just old pasture areas, spots where they're just overgrown and nobody kind of maintained them anymore. Go in there with a chainsaw and clean up a few cedar trees, knock them out of the way, and you open it back up again, and now you've got one of these little staging area food plots. So they're out there. You just kind of got to look for them, and I guess if you have enough control of the property and you don't mind bringing a bulldozer in, you could even make them. And certainly that would make that property better because they are that much easier to hunt. So now I want to talk about exactly how do you hunt these spots. The tendency is to get into a tree stand or put the blind right where the deer come out of the timber in the evenings and come into the opening. But the problem with that is you don't really have a safe wind, because if you set up where the wind is blowing directly away from where the deer are coming from, it's going to be blowing into the opening. And if the buck you're hunting is the first one that comes out, you're fine, but usually he's not. Now you got does and other deer, non-target deer, that get into the opening. Now they're downwind. That's not going to work. So if you try to play a crosswind there, a lot of times you're still catching the deer coming out of the bedding areas and kind of circling around the end. Sometimes there's even bedding areas, off to both sides. And that's not going to work either, because now your scent is still blowing to the deer. So the only way to hunt these effectively is to hunt on the other end, the direction away from where the deer come out, and let them work to you. And you got to be a little bit more patient, because sometimes they don't make it all the way to you before they peel off and go someplace else. But you're still in the game. You're not educating deer. Time is still on your side. It's way better to be conservative in these kind of locations than it is to be aggressive. Plus now you can play a crosswind, because if the larger feeding area is straight behind you, you don't really want to play a wind blowing straight into that. But you can work off either crosswind, and the deer are going to work, or they're going to come right on through. So again, it's a transition area, which is to your advantage because the deer don't hang up there. They move through. It's easy to get in and out. You don't spook a lot of deer. You can plant a few cedar trees or whatever to enhance your entry exit routes. There's stuff you can do to really develop these into incredibly effective spots. And that's what I did, and they became the best spots on my farm, and that one in particular was the best that I ever hunted. So try to find spots like that. I really feel like it's worth the investment of time and energy to develop at least one of these in the area where you hunt. So now let's talk about next week's episode. And I don't know if I'm going to have one out on Monday right away, or if it's going to be a little bit later in the week. Our son and I are going to go canoeing in the Quetico, which is the Canadian side of the Boundary Waters canoe area on the US. And they've just opened that remote area border crossing finally after 2 years. So the last time we went in there was 2019. So it was closed in 20, closed in 21, and now finally we've got our permits and we can cross there and go into the Quetico again. So we're going to take advantage of that and go up there for a few days. And I mean, it's beautiful. The canoeing is awesome. The fishing can be just dynamite. We're just going to have some quality time and have some fun. So hopefully I can get back in time to have something out early next week. And I really want to dive into more on this topic of how do you create this trail camera survey? How do you get the information, the trail camera scouting that I talked about in the last episode of October versus November, and how important it is to have information so you can make good decisions in October. Well, I appreciate you joining me. We'll see you right back here again next week for the next episode of Bowhunting Whitetails. And remember to always dream big.